So my name is Patrick Paul Walsh. So this is a side event of University College Dublin, because we've consulted a status with the UN Economic and Social Council. And I am a Professor of International Development Studies in University College Dublin, but I'm also on secondment for the next 5 years to the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, in particular Vice President of Education. So today, what I want you to think about is, I know we're all in our houses all over the world, but this is an official side event of the UN Science, Technology, Innovation Forum. And, so hopefully for the next hour or so, we'll feel like we're at the side event. And to be fair, we will record this, and we actually do a 2-page summary, which goes to the co-chairs of the SDI, who do a report, and it becomes a report to the deliberations of the HLPF, because this is a subcommittee of the High Level Political Forum. So obviously this subcommittee is emphasizing one very key means of implementation for the SDGs, which we call technology or science, technology, innovation. And today, hopefully, on the call today, we have what I call content providers, like myself and the SDG Academy have wonderful education resources and MOOCs. We've Radhika from Columbia University, who's working on Mission 4.7, wonderful curriculum and resources for Mission 4.7. And then we also have experts on repositories, open education repositories, and on libraries and partnerships with libraries. So hopefully I'll convince you that libraries and their technologies and the partnerships they can create are actually quite essential to the storage of knowledge and the transfer of knowledge, particularly to the global south. And this is the mission, obviously, of the technology facilitation mechanism is a core aspect of the Science, Technology, Innovation Forum, that for the SDGs to happen, we have to have pathways to sustainable development in the high-income countries, but in the low to medium-income countries, we also need pathways, and the idea is that we should be transferring our knowledge and our capacities and our technologies as quick as possible. And I think global library infrastructures are the ideal way to deliver this knowledge, and hopefully you'll learn a lot about that today. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So really we're just giving you 5 or 6 minutes to say who we are, and we'll direct you to certain resources that you might like to follow up. But I'll keep an eye on the Whova chat in particular, any questions, so hopefully we'll get 20 minutes to have a bit of a Q&A so people can ask clarification questions or add some of their own reflections or contributions to this discussion. So Thanos Giannakopoulo is he's the chief librarian of the United Nations Dag Hammarskjöld Library at the UN headquarters in New York. And I won't read out his biopic, but he is a leader in this area of open science, and I'm just going to let you explain, Thanos, the sort of things you're working on, the projects and the conferences you've been working on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone joining us for this session. This is really a wonderful theme, and it is a theme that is very close to our heart and our work here at the UN Headquarters Library, but also for libraries, UN Secretariat libraries across the globe. I think a lot of time has passed from the time that Selby Food declared that a university is just a group of buildings around the library. A lot of things have happened since then, and most importantly, the acceleration and the development of the digital realm. Fast forward to a very influential and very important report released by the UN Secretary General. The report is called Our Common Agenda, which is the Secretary General's for the future and his vision for the future of humanity, the future of the planet, and the future of the UN Secretariat itself. In that report, the UN Secretary General clearly states that it is time for us to regain the digital commons. And it is exactly in this notion and this concept of the digital commons that the UN Headquarters Library has, along with, in collaboration with libraries and partners in civil society, has been working vehemently in the last 5 years to mainstream and operationalize as much as possible the suite of practices that belong to the movement of open science. And I'm using the term movement because we now consider that open science is not only a bottom-up, but also a top-down activity. So since then, we have worked strongly around the notion of creating synergies and partnerships through a global conference that the UN Headquarters Library has been managing, always in collaboration with the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and in particular, the Division of Sustainable Development Goals. As we all know, open science is a major accelerator for all the SDGs, not only for one particular SDG. But since we're concentrating on the notion of partnerships, we have created a lot of projects that have sprung up from this conference. And on one of these projects I would like to elaborate today. I will share the resources of the conference. I will also share the resources of our upcoming third Global Open Science Conference in November 2022. And I wanted to collaborate mostly on what has happened on the UN Secretariat libraries, because I think as civil servants, as servants of the governmental organization realm of information, we need not only talk the talk, but also walk the walk. So since 2018, the UN's Headquarters Library, the Hammarskjöld Library in New York, the UN Library in Geneva, as well as the regional commission libraries, Vienna, Beirut, and recently Bangkok, which was an addition to this wonderful collaboration, have worked together under the leadership of the UN Headquarters Library here in New York to release the UN Digital Commons interpretation that the libraries have done, which we call the Central Repository of the UN Secretariat. That is the United Nations Digital Library. This has been a learning curve for all of us. We have learned a lot, but I believe that we have also achieved a lot by releasing the central repository and creating partnerships around this repository, so we could have not only at the input front, but also at the output front, the majority of content that is relevant for policymakers, researchers, and citizens worldwide to fully understand the deliberations of the United Nations. The platform, the repository, the UN Digital Library has now reached the point that has received awards, and we have reached over 30 million unique downloads in 1 year. However, we're still developing, we're still uploading content. The content is immense. There is an anarchy on the digital content front, and this is a massive, massive undertaking. But there are 4 libraries that are in partnerships, and not only 4 libraries that are in partnerships, but we do collaborate with other departments as well, in the sense that we are their dissemination interface for the content. We have standardized approach to the creation of metadata. And in that process, we thought that we're talking about open science, so let's open metadata as well. So similarly to that, we released our first linked data product, which is a way to open metadata. So we're not only opening content, we're also opening metadata at the same time. All this together gives a picture. I wouldn't like to get too much into the technical details. I'll be happy to in the questions, but all of this gives us a little bit of a picture of a roadmap of how, for example, a resolution starts from a meeting minutes up to a draft resolution, up to an adopted resolution, up to the speech. So this is a little bit of an approach that we have in order to give a holistic view of specific deliberation or activity within the UN Secretariat. At the same time, we are dedicated to keeping all this content in the public domain, again, in the tradition of the open science suite of practices. We are dedicated to making this content interoperable. We are opening the platform so other platforms could interoperably gain content. And at the same time, we do believe, as UN librarians, and I chair the committee of UN Secretariat librarians across the globe, that it is time for all of us to start thinking about the Creative Commons licensing, a licensing that is open for the distribution. The Creative Commons has a specific manifestation, which is the IGO, CC IGO by 4.0. We're still discussing about that, and I think we should enhance this discussion, because I don't think I need to emphasize too much here what access to policymaking and policymaking content means for everyone, not only for researchers. To elaborate and perhaps open this a little bit outside the UN Secretariat libraries, I think that within the context of facilitating SDGs, within the context of considering how interconnected and indivisible SDGs are, the existing partnerships on the ground, the partnerships that libraries have developed across the globe, and by the way, the UN headquarters library is also managing the UN Depository Libraries program, which is about 350 libraries from 130 countries. So there's already partnerships like the UN Depository Libraries. There are similar partnerships across the globe, which constitute a network, constitute a trusted network, constitute a tried network. And it is a network that works, sometimes even without even knowing it, on disseminating and actually promoting content of that contributes to the facilitation of the SDGs. What I think is an important point for librarians, citizens, researchers is the notion of platform power. So libraries are already managing repositories. They're managing the repositories with institutional funding. And libraries at the same time also work very closely with funders. The funders that actually get standards on the ground regarding science making. So I think closer alliance between libraries and funders can create a very interesting power dynamic that can help in revisiting a little bit the research assessment practices in universities, and at the same time revisiting the outdated publishing model that is being used at the moment, still being used at the moment. At the times of open science, we do have a quite outdated publishing model that relates to the times of Gutenberg rather than the times of open science as they are today. And very related to this, I just read it last night, a very interesting study from the London School of Economics that the more or less classified content from the US National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. These are consensus reports. They are very authoritative consensus reports on science, in order just to see, when we talk about open access, we're thinking like, you know, a researcher wants to read a high quality scientific knowledge output. And we have been saying that it is not only the researcher, it is also the citizen, it is also the community scientists that want to read this high quality scientific knowledge output. And I was delighted to read this study yesterday to find out that there are a lot of educators, a lot of students, there are a lot of citizens that are just reading what we would call high quality scientific knowledge. So this open access does indeed have an impact, not only for the researcher, but the citizen worldwide. And in closing, and getting back to key points from the Global Open Science Conference in 2021, where more than 5,000 people attended, a major output was that we're talking about COVID-19, and indeed there was an unprecedented openness of content in COVID-19. However, regarding climate science, only a fragment of research on climate science is available free of charge for people to read. At the same time, we, the UN, are asking people around the world, you have to act locally on climate science. So at the same time, simultaneously, we have this irregularity, and I consider it irrationality, that citizens all over the world do not have access to climate science. And I will not delve into disinformation and misinformation about science and the distrust that was developed about science. It seems that trusted science beyond paywalls and disinformation and misinformation is free. And I'd like to close on that. And thank again, Dr. Walsh, for inviting us.
Yeah, no, I could listen to Thanos all day because these are such important points, but we're going to come back to them. I was very taken with the one where you're linking all the committees and documents as something evolves into a resolution. I think that's really fascinating how that's done. But you made other much more important points as well. So we'll move on to the next speaker, Zeynep Varoglu. Is a program specialist in the Digital Innovation and Transformation section of the Communications and Information sector at UNESCO headquarters in Paris. And in the interest of time, I'll just hand the floor over to you, Zeynep. You're muted.
I'm going to open my microphone and then I'm going to on my screen.
Okay, great. So can you share, okay?
Yeah, I will. Yes, I hope so. Let's see.
Yeah.
1 second. Here we go. Do you see my screen?
Yeah, perfect.
You see the slides you should be seeing?
Yeah, I see them. Yeah, implementing the.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so today I'm going to go very quickly, and to build on the previous speaker, I'm going to speak on the Unesco Oer Recommendation. This recommendation was adopted in November 2019, and it is the only instrument of UNESCO in the area of education and technologies, and it has a very strong link to the topics that we're speaking about, as it addresses scientific research and also data protection and that interoperability of different platforms. So let's go down. Why doesn't this go? Okay, just very quickly, for those that don't know, what is UNESCO? We're a specialized agency of the UN. We're in headquarters in Paris with field offices in over 50 countries. There are 193 member states representing all continents on this planet. And the reason we work in this area, that is open educational resources, open solutions, open licensing to knowledge creation, is linked to something that happened much before the internet and much before, well, over 70 years ago. It's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in particular Article 19, which is on media, receiving and imparting information and ideas through media, any media, regardless of frontier and of frontiers, and of course the right to education, Article 26. In UNESCO's constitution, there is a commitment to the free exchange of ideas and knowledge, and this also supports the sharing of knowledge using technology. So that is the mandate as to why we're working in this space. The recommendation looks like this. You can find it on the UNESCO website. The easiest way, unfortunately, is to go into Google and type in Legal Instruments UNESCO Recommendation on OER. And what you see on the right side of my screen is made intentionally so you can't read it, but it basically shows you that up until 2019, there were about 12 recommendations in similar areas. And that's to point out that a recommendation at UNESCO is a very serious matter. It's a normative instrument. We have only conventions and recommendations that are actually in use. And they call upon member states to take actions in the area that they address and report on it every 4 months at the governmental level forever. So this is something which is quite a commitment, and they are adopted by consensus by 193 countries. So this carries with it a certain weight. So it is quite important that there was recommendation in the area of openly licensed educational materials. One on open science followed 2 years later, as the previous speaker mentioned in his intervention. Now, this is the definition that we have of open educational resources. It's extremely important because this definition has been sort of moved around a little bit during the pandemic, but it's really quite clear what it is. It's learning, teaching, and research materials in any format or medium that reside in the public domain under a copyright that's been released under an open license that permits no cost, access, reuse, repurposing, adaptation, and redistribution by others. And there is a definition of open license, and it refers to a license that respects intellectual property rights of the copyright owner, provides permissions granting the right to access, reuse, repurpose, adapt, redistribute educational materials. We don't say the word Creative Commons because the principle is the principle of open license. But this is very important because educational resources, especially during the pandemic, have been given away free. It's not just free that's important here. It's the fact that you can legally access them, reuse them, repurpose them, adapt them, and redistribute them. And now the next part is the stakeholders. And as you will see, it's a very long list of stakeholders that have been identified. And inside this list of stakeholders, you have, of course, the educational community with the relevant institutional and governmental bodies, research institutions, civil society, but you also have cultural institutions and libraries and archives and museums. And so this is the signal that the recommendation is really for the larger knowledge community. What it looks like inside. There's a lot more text, I can assure you, than here, but I'm giving you a nutshell view of what it says. The first part 1A of this recommendation, is that stakeholders should be able to have the capacity and the digital skills to create, access, reuse, redistribute OER, and understand its added value. There is a call for open license tools and platforms to make open educational resources available easily. And there is a call in there for interoperation of metadata and standards. There are 20 mentions of the word research. I haven't gone into each one and put it here, but I just wanted to signal it's in the definition. So it's linked to that. The second part is actually not on the slide, it's policy in the document. And it's about procurement models that support the need for open licensing, guidelines and standards at national and institutional level to create access to support the use of OER, incentives for teachers and professional bodies, and then an alignment for other open licensing policies. So open access, open data, open source software, and open science. There is also a clause in the policy section on data protection. And that clause was put in there, really sorry, something in my throat. That clause was put in there by IFLA during the time that it was being, the text was being discussed in the expert group meeting, the intergovernmental meeting. IFLA was observer at this meeting, which means that it was invited to come in and provide its inputs to the document. And IFLA is a category 2, IFLA is a NGO with consultative status to UNESCO. And it was invited to come and provide inputs to the document. So the way it works is that observers, that means non-member states, provide their inputs, and member states are then invited to confirm that they agree with it. And member states were very happy with this idea. But in 2019, so I know that the last 2 years for many of us is a bit of a blur, and 2019 seems much longer than 2 years ago, but it was actually 3 years ago. But at the time, data was not really high in the vocabulary of many people. So this was important that they brought this in. The third part is about quality, multilingual, inclusive OER. It's about language issues, making sure that it's not only in English. Related to vulnerable groups and persons with disabilities, making it accessible. And then issues of quality assurance and making sure that OER is comparable or if not better in quality of materials than traditional and non-traditional QA through traditional and non-traditional QA mechanisms. The fourth part is sustainability. In a nutshell, it's basically to strategies so that teachers and learners don't shoulder the cost of the learning materials and incentives for stakeholders to use OER. And the last part is on international cooperation with the idea that all those stakeholders in my earlier slide really need to work together, both interregionally, regionally, intersectorally, in order for these recommendations to be effectively implemented. I will stop here because my brief was on digital innovation, but I think I have to also put into place, say something here about the fact that at the beginning of the pandemic, UNESCO made a call for joint action. So this was when everybody was changing everything they could in order to maintain education worldwide. And there was a call at the time to make sure that the challenges of this past pandemic, or current pandemic, depends where you are, lays the foundation to systematically provide best practices for sharing knowledge in the post-COVID-19 future of learning. And I think there we have to underscore that OER is an important part of this post-pandemic future of learning. And I think that's where we are now in history. We're somewhere towards the end or into something different from when everything was happening. And in the since this discussion, there has been, of course, the Open Science recommendation of UNESCO, and inside this recommendation, OER is recognized as a key tool for capacity building. And it's mentioned 5 times within this recommendation. And what's interesting is that the definition I showed you just earlier of open licensing is taken up again in the Open Science recommendation. So with that, I would like to thank you very much and invite you to reach out if you have any further need for information. Thank you.
Okay, Zeynep, that was excellent. And as somebody obviously looking after the resource of the SDG Academy, I just think that OER and this whole approach is just so important, particularly if your mission is to disseminate this work and get people using it for free and in an open license, etc. I think it's really excellent. So we're moving on, just in the interest of time, to the next speaker, Niamh Brennan, who's a program manager for research informatics at Trinity College Dublin, where she works on research reporting, evaluation, and impact. And she's responsible for the development of Trinity's research support system and institutional repository called TARA, Trinity's access to research archive. But she's also a member of Ireland's National Open Science Forum and DART Europe, and also OpenAlRE, kind of more global. But I'll hand the floor over to you, Niamh, and we'll try and keep it to 6-7 minutes. We'll try and claw back a little time if we can.
I will try and do that, Paul. I've set a timer for myself. I have to remember to look at it. So that's my big problem here. So I'm just going to go into my PowerPoint here. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yeah, perfect.
So I'm going to follow on from the previous 2 excellent speakers. Thank you so much, Thanos and Zeynep, for your introduction to this. I want to focus very quickly on OER, which Zeynep has just been giving us that brilliant background from the UNESCO recommendations, in the context of what Thanos was talking about, the overall open science or open research agenda. What I'm trying to do is very quickly, within the context particularly of the SDG Academy, to look at this challenge that we have of trying to create interoperability and accessibility and so on of our OER. So I've titled this Open Science Meets Open Education for the SDGs. And this is what it looks like, my little logo. First of all, I want to look at first principles based on a mixture of the Budapest Open Access 20 recommendations. So what we've learned from 20 years of open science. Then the idea of making OER fair. and my idea of ministering to OER. So let's take a look at this here. You'll all have seen this graphic before. It's from Foster, and it firmly positions open education resources alongside and clustered with this beehive of open research or open science. So it's very much there, very closely connected with citizen science and social networks and so on, and open source. Many of you will have been very aware of the Budapest Open Access Initiative. It was the 20th anniversary of that initiative that really started it all and built on the open source movement. Budapest, the 20 recommendations came down to 4, and it came out of a really, I suppose, intense and honest and sincere analysis of where we are. The kind of dismay that a lot of librarians have looked at how many commercial entities have really taken over open access, and how that has created yet another divide, as if we needed another one there in our information inequity landscape. What they recommended was that we host open access, or let's translate it into OER, on an open infrastructure. That we would reform research, our teaching, assessment and rewards to improve incentives. That we'd favour inclusive distribution channels that never exclude authors or creators on economic grounds. And that fits in very much with the UNESCO recommendations. And when we spend money to publish, to make our open research available, remember that it's not an end in itself, but there are goals to which openness is intended to serve. And that includes favouring models that benefits all of the regions in the world, that are academy and scholar led, and that to step away from anything that's going to conflict with these goals. This Budapest is looking specifically at open science, but it also aligns very much with the UNESCO recommendations on both OER and on open science. So let's take a quick look. For me, what I wanted to show to you today is that my theory that OER are very like research data for all of these reasons here that you can have a look at later on. Particularly, they can be composite, they can be complex, they can hold multiple copyrights within them. They're not tracked or cited or rewarded in the same ways as journal articles and other kinds of outputs that we get from our academic institutions. Very like research data. OER are intended, these are the 5 R's of OER, to be retained, redistributed, reused, revised, and remixed. They don't have anything like the structure that research data have evolved around them of late, with GoFair, with data management plan online, standard templates for the creation of the data management plans, data citation indices, and inclusion on open science metrics. So what I suggest is that we make, and this is very specific part of this, that we make OER fair, that we make OER findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It's a really practical step in all of this. So there's increasing acceptance of the FAIR principles, as many of you know, and I don't think that I need to go into this at all. Starting with the FAIR guiding principles in 2016, we find all the way down into these various associations, including the NIH, adopting the FAIR principles to management of data. And remember, I'm suggesting that we use these principles to manage our open education resources and solve some of the issues we have with them. These are some of the international funders actively promoting FAIR. From Science Europe, Wellcome Trust, we're looking at the NIH, as I mentioned, the European Commission, UNESCO, and more specifically promoting the FAIR principles. So why wouldn't we associate this with OER? They're needed because of the increasing availability of online resources. The fact that what we create needs to be created with longevity in mind, and we've mentioned interoperability a few times here already. We need to increase our transparency and the knowledge discovery. And we also need to find ways to better organize the resources so that they can be easily accessed, understood, exchanged, and reused. And that's what the FAIR principles are for. So how to be fair, many of you know this already, but I'm applying this to OER, borrowing from Libra's example. Findable, there's the metadata and persistent identifiers like DOIs associated with these objects, or elements or separate components of the objects. They're accessible, they're understandable to humans and machines, that the OER are deposited into trusted repositories, such as the UN Digital Library, for example. They're interoperable, and this is where Thanos was talking about the linked open data, that the metadata use a formal, accessible, shared, and applicable broadly applicable knowledge, language of knowledge for knowledge representation. And finally, that they're reusable. They have clear usage licenses that have been mentioned in every presentation so far, and they provide an accurate information on provenance. What that looks like then is Creative Commons has been mentioned before. What I'm going to suggest here is that Creative Commons licenses, because I can mention this here, facilitate both the FAIR principles and the 5 R's of OER. An example, let's say, for example, for the SDG Academy would be to produce a CC BY attribution, share alike. It's distributed under the same license, so it can't be commercialized. And you're adding non-commercialization to this as well. This answers lots of our problems. What I'm suggesting in addition, I'm going to finish here, Paul, is that this is my own acronym, that we minister to our OER, that we as institutions, funders, agencies, that we provide next generation metrics to track them and their usage, to provide skills and training to the academics, the researchers and the librarians who are involved in managing them, and to provide incentives and rewards around them. Finally, I'll leave you with this, to remember the goals, bringing them all together, and to remember to be fair, findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable, and to take care. And this is a direct quote from the UNESCO Open Science Recommendations. Combine fair and take care. Care stands for collective benefit, authority to control, and the responsibility and ethics. Thank you very much. Let's stop sharing.
Thank you, Niamh. Yeah, there you go. Thank you, Niamh. That was excellent. So I love this idea of putting on the FAIR principles on top of OER, and then to minister the OER as well. I think it's really excellent. I guess for people listening, they might say, what's all these acronyms, you know, but the bottom line is just means that when people produce educational resources for free, that they're easy to get, to use, they're not commercialized, they feed everywhere all over the world, but that needs a particular infrastructure, a particular platform, and that's what the libraries are offering us, because all that technology is there. But excellent. And I probably said that wrong now and I've destroyed your whole presentation, but hopefully not.
Very well, Paul.
All right. So we move on to our next speaker, Radhika lyengar, and she's she's a director of education in the Center for Sustainable Development at the Earth Institute, Columbia University, but also she's a lead on Mission 4.7 and is putting together some very nice curriculums. So she's, you know, potentially a content provider for these OERs that can be put the fairs on top and ministers properly, etc. So I'll let you speak. I'll give you the floor, Radhika.
Thank you, Paul, and such an honor to be following our esteemed panelists here. After hearing the global perspective, I want you to come to my town in New Jersey. Small town, 20,000 population. And what we did at the pandemic actually was the incentive for my work in my professional life. And there's no now professional and personal lives are blurred for all of us here. So what happened was during the pandemic, and I'm sure this you can relate to a lot of this, is that the schools were closed, and then we were not able to, you know, first continue our education as the kids were not able to continue their education. So what we did was, in our community, only a Zoom link was needed, and then all the community members and their children, and you know, we all joined our Zoom, and we continued our education through our Zoom meetings. One was a poet in my community, the other one was a writer, so you know, poetic skills, writing skills. Then there was another person who was a chartered accountant. All that continued in a way of like one person was, you know, doing, you know, marvelous job at doing eco-friendly stuff in the community. So we learned from each other, and our education continued. The mothers were involved, the kids were involved. So we used to come on a Zoom call every evening around 4 o'clock. It was all about saying, hello, how are you doing? And continue our education. Slowly, we started, you know, creating this cadre of students, including mothers, called the Eco Ambassadors. And we started inviting Columbia University scientists to come and speak about plastic pollution, come and speak to us about, what they find in the ocean when they go out for their expeditions. And it became a very organic way of speaking to someone new who would make the research so accessible that there would be all these questions that the students started coming up. In terms of the content, so we had these YouTube videos that we had put in. So many students got involved. They started doing their own presentation. What I realized was that the students lacked the content. They would just do a Google search on plastic pollution and then whatever came up. And so we had to do a lot of corrections, and there were so many other things that was involved. So I think what we are discussing here, I think we are 10 years behind. We should fast track this, because otherwise we have students there eager to learn. There is this old fashion of banking education system, like there's information coming from the teacher and going to the student. That is no longer there. Students are on their own, looking on the internet, learning on their own, creating these non-linear pathways of learning. So I think there needs to be this ramping up of OERs, making sure that these links are accessible to everyone. And students did such an amazing job of taking books that are for undergrad and making their own and creating their own curriculum. So I think there is this way of, so this was done with Professor Sachs's book on Age for Sustainable Development. They took the chapter on energy and started saying, okay, but what about this? What about that? What about all the other things? And they started making their own curriculum and said, I want to learn about this. And where can we find the curriculum? So I was in a fix, like, okay, where do we find curriculum on energy and sustainability that relates to a 7th grade student? So I think then, and also mothers, we started saying we need to upgrade our skills. What do we do here, and how do we learn from each other, and where do we find the material? So that was my exploration of where is this material and how, and they were all climate related, people who wanted to focus on climate related work. At the same time, we started, along with Unesco Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Paul's SDG Academy, as well as Pope's Pontifical Academy of Sciences, as well as other entities who came together, including UNESCO. Ban Ki-moon Center came together to form this Mission 4.7. And I'll share the link here. It's Mission 4 POINT7, and we started curating materials that are out there so that our students, our communities are able to do this, are able to at least learn from each other. We have a community that we have, somehow they just wanted to come together. Hundreds of schools join our online discussions. We have people from all over the world coming and discussing global citizenship education. Professor Sachs, of course, is there focusing on sustainable development. We had many other, again, scientists from Columbia University focusing on this. So I think there needs to be a YouTube organic exploration of how things are. What are the students asking? What do they want to learn, rather than just providing them the content? What is it that they want to co-create with us? And what are the scientists saying, and how do we reach the community the fastest? So through Mission 4.7, we've been able to have these Fridays for Future sessions online, where hundreds of school students join, teachers join. We have plastic pollution challenges that we've come up with. A lot of things that we've been able to do in just because of the pandemic. One good thing that came out of the pandemic is that there is no longer one teacher, one school in New Jersey. Now the school has expanded to a globe, and anyone joins from Ethiopia, from Ghana, and they are taking the SDGs and localizing it. And we do storytelling sessions. We've been partnering with SDGs today, focusing on creating these story maps, which is all about live data and integrating those live data points, real-time data into stories and lessons. There are children who are preparing story maps on how polluted Ganga is, the Ganga River in New Delhi, and what is the history, what is the sociology, what are the scientific facts about the pollution, and what is the government doing. So it's a lot of advocacy work. It's also a lot of accountability work, and it has taken us, it's again driven by the eco ambassadors that we have, who've been able to shape a lot of our content. Meanwhile, as researchers of Columbia University, we also need to be making sure that our frameworks are valid. Our frameworks are holistic. So we've been able to provide an educational resource platform on Mission 4.7 website. It's in a beta version. And of course, I think that's my discussion with Paul, that we need to be having much more of a collaboration with libraries and open sources, that we can all come together so that synthesis of research, what does global citizenship mean and how is it translated into school systems, and what are students doing to personalize it. And I think all of the ESD part, we work with the Education for Sustainable Development wing of UNESCO very closely, and they've been able to support a lot of our work, share all the reports. We at Mission 4.7 is this intermediary between UNESCO's Ban Ki-moon centers and try to work on synthesis of reports, create a community, have these professional development of teachers. It's also professional development on our side as well, because every time we do a session, I think there needs to be some kind of a, I guess, exchange community that is built up. We would love to use the UN resources. Climate education, I think one of our speakers, Thanos, mentioned that it is a movement, and climate education cannot wait. And we need to have those resources up in the shared with the community. The best part is that we are not alone. There are many students and teachers who are developing these products or these modules, education modules with us, contextualizing it into their own settings. So I think a lot of work needs to be done. I think it's time to ramp up whatever resources that we can, share it with community-wide resources, link universities to resources. A big shout out to UNESCO's Prospects journal, which is run by Simona Popa. She's been able to work with us really fast, because COVID required us to work on synthesizing these materials, working on journals and working on papers very quickly. So she's been able to take a lot of our work. There are 8th graders who are writing a chapter in our books these days. So I think those open access materials and giving a sense to teachers and principals here, and what the students are sharing, I think is something that we need to really focus on and help students to not only learn from their peers, but also learn from their peers in different countries. And I'm so glad to be a part of this panel, that I think now the future looks really bright in terms of using these open resources and co-creating materials as we go along. Thank you.
Okay, Radhika, so that was excellent, and I could see the librarians, particularly Niamh, when you were mentioning the co-creation, because this is part of curriculum and part of what's going on with the SDGs. Is it's always updated. It always has to be debated and renewed and updated and co-created. But of course, no problem. Metadata and identifiers and everything can cope with all of that within an appropriate platform. But so that's what I took from that talk, which is I think it was excellent. So I'm going to, you said lots of other things, but I was just relating it to the depository and the challenge of co-creation. It actually isn't actually a challenge. It actually could support that. So the final talk, I'm giving the floor to Stephen Wyber, and he is the manager policy and he's the manager of policy and advocacy at the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, IFLA, which was mentioned earlier. So I hand the floor to you, Stephen, to do sweeper, as we call it.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. And I hope my voice doesn't sound too bad. I've got a sort of sore enough throat to mean that I probably wouldn't have been allowed into a physical venue anyway. So I'm glad that we're doing this one online. As Patrick said, I think my role here is sweeper, and I'm going to try and bring together some of the points that have been made, add a few. It's going to be a little bit of a spam sausage. And so hopefully throughout you'll hear some of the themes that have come out already, and I'll throw in a couple of my own. I think before listing, I think there are two really interconnected points that really ran across this all. Firstly, this idea that open isn't enough. And I like the fact that Patrick said at the beginning, it referenced this idea of a global, Patrick and Thanos referenced this idea of commons. And so we've seen in our common agenda this idea of a global digital commons, We've had in UNESCO's Future of Education and Futures of Education report a reference to a global knowledge commons. And we know from Eleanor Ostrom that commons can survive and commons can thrive, and selfishness does not need to destroy things, create tragedies of the commons. But in order to get there, we need governance, and we actually need to pay some attention. The Wild West doesn't work. Connected to that is the fact that we can't do that alone. This has to be a collaborative effort, in particular if we don't want to just hand over the keys to the castle to commercial or private actors. Definitely in the open access space, in the open science space, one of the things that comes out of the UNESCO recommendation is this concern about community-owned infrastructure and not just commercially owned infrastructure. Similarly, we do also want to make sure it's not just third parties that have different motivations and different priorities that do it. So to dive into, I think I've got 7 ideas down. In each case, I think each of these are areas where partnerships are necessary, things we need to do to make sure that we go from open to the impacts of open, to realizing that potential. Given my affiliation, I will of course argue that libraries are essential in each case. So just there's a forewarning on that one. So I think the first issue that came up and that was highlighted by Radhika, it's been highlighted by others, is that for open to work, we need to make sure that everyone gets to do the talking and the teaching. We need to be investing in making sure that researchers around the world, teachers around the world are supported or enabled to actually generate content. We know perfectly well, lots of great OER from the US may be fine, but maybe that's not going to be the most useful tool in Tanzania. It's not going to be the most useful tool in Cambodia or wherever else. We need to try and work out ways of ensuring that we're bringing together content from different parts of the world. Funders have a role here, education ministries, compensation reward systems, libraries too have a way, a means that have skills in terms of helping teachers get their stuff out there. Connectivity, Thanos mentioned this in a comment in the chat. Clearly, the open movement is so tightly connected with the spread of the internet because it meant that you no longer had to have a printing press and a distribution network to get your ideas out there. Still, barely 50% of the global population has connectivity, and that's a pretty loose definition of connectivity as well. The number of people who have high quality connectivity is lower. So we need to work together. There's some great examples from Africa of open access organizations working with universities, working with research and education networks, working with internet providers in order to make sure that people do have the connectivity they need to teach, to contribute, to learn. Again, libraries can be part of this. They're great community nodes. There's a lot of talk at the moment about connecting all schools. We hope that that will also extend to libraries as well as centres for learning, for research, for education. Picking up on the point that Zeynep made, we need to make sure that we are doing open in a way that is compatible with other norms. There is plenty of stuff open on the internet that probably shouldn't be there. Certainly, we need to take account of privacy. There is the concern that too often open educational resources or open access in general can be used as bait. Effectively, it is a way for private companies to bring people in, to lure people in and gather data that they can subsequently monetize. More broadly, we have to accept that making everything open is not a particularly culturally sensitive choice in many situations. Certainly when thinking about how we respect the interests of Indigenous communities, we need to bear in mind that sticking everything out there is not appropriate. It can be alienating, it can be disenfranchising, it can be disrespectful. How we deal with this, it's understanding the communities we're working with, giving people the tools to manage the information they're creating, to manage the information that belongs to their communities. Again, that can be done with libraries in local areas, with the communities themselves. My fourth point was that we need to develop those skills, the appreciation of the importance, and alongside that, the appreciation of the importance of science. I think often people who would like open access to go more slowly will point out the mistakes that are made or things that are published and then retracted, or broadly imply or play to the idea that if you're not paid for something, it can't be any good. I think we're seeing more broadly in the world at the moment, there's just a need to convince people that actually, you know, research is helpful and important, and there is such a thing as high quality and low quality information, and that people need to be curious, and they need to sadly accept that there's always going to be some degree of uncertainty, of ambiguity, but they need to have the curiosity to go out there to question ideas, to actually value scientific information. Parallel with that is, how do you identify quality research? Something that Radhika pointed out in the context of open educational resources. How can you help people pick the resources that are most useful, not just take the first search result on Google? This is something that libraries have experience in particular, how to avoid simplistic ready reckoners. We've had a lot of issues in the past with the idea being spread that open access and predatory journals risk being the same thing, or extremely simplistic models that I'm sorry, the dog is going. Extremely simplistic models that effectively suggest that journals and resources that come from particular countries are less valuable than others. The fifth point is around discoverability, around how you actually build those platforms. And this is simply what Thanos was saying. There's so much stuff on the internet, but if we want stuff to be discoverable, if we want stuff to be findable, we need to make sure that the platforms are well designed, that we have metadata, and in particular that they've been put together by people who have an idea of how users access information, how users find information, and that these platforms are responsive. The sixth point is that we need to think about policy interfaces, because there's so much information out there, but if we want it to be used in order to drive policy reform, we need to have people, we need to have institutions who are getting that information in front of the authorities. And this is, to some large extent, this is Thanos' job. It's making sure that UN decisions and that UN officials and their analysis are basing it on the best information out there. It's the job of parliamentary libraries, of government libraries around the world. Then the final point is also as community interfaces. Because also, and this is one of the benefits of working with libraries, it's a big network on the ground. We have millions of libraries out there that can really take this information out to people, help them engage with it. The sorts of initiatives that Radhika was talking about. How can we promote citizen science? How can we get over the idea that people will just automatically reach out and look for information, give them the tools, give them the possibilities to actually work with it? So I think that's my sort of overview. I will stop so that at least there's some time for summing up and maybe questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And it was a joy to hear your dog. I'm lucky I have a few dogs in the background. They're not barking at the moment. No, I think very nice summary. And I think this is the minister point that Niamh was making about, and it was made by others about, you know, from the funders. It's like this circle, like the end users in a sense, like the policy people in universities, people, the communities. In a sense, they have to get involved at the beginning, in the sense that the policies and how the content is created and how it's funded, you know, that it needs to go in this nice circular flow. And so it's not as simple as having a wonderful repository with all the bells and whistles. That it really has to be in that middle, you know, when we're getting the content, providing it, and then using it. It's just such a circular flow. So I see Thanos is there. Do you want to, we have a few minutes for questions. I think people on the Zoom call, in theory, could just come on if they put up their hand. And I think Thanos wanted to make a point. Did you?
No, not really. I mean, I just wanted to sort of like, you know, stress the fact that, you know, the open access, you know, should be or could define open access for whom, and it is. We are at the moment now, though, however, that I think every argument is a justification for further openly access to science, and the fact that there are indeed cases of predatory journals, it only means we need to further open access to the record of science. We have a wonderful statement. Of course, we have UNESCO, and I want to thank UNESCO for leading this globally. We have the recommendation Open Science, which is the first global instrument, the first official definition. And it comes with a weight that 193 member states have sort of like ratified it, and now they need to do work on it. We have the International Science Council recommendation on opening the record of science. I think we need to start by considering that science is a public good and not intellectual property. This is the great open conversation of science, and I don't understand how, you know, in this long history, we ended up closing the conversation of science rather than opening it more. And there, especially for emergencies and challenges. And I think COVID-19 is a great example. And I only want to nod to the wonderful work that Radhika is doing, and also the suggestions for minister. I'm all for it, and I think we need to talk bilaterally, Niamh. This is a wonderful, I mean, next generation metrics is actually what you need, because we need metrics for the platforms and we need metrics for the research assessment in the universities. So it's an interesting combination there. And I think libraries do have some fair ideas about that. And they're always fair, I think. So that's all I wanted to say. And thank you once again.
Okay. So we're a little bit over time, but so let me just thank all the speakers, and hopefully people watching this back on YouTube and who are here today kind of suddenly get a sense that libraries could be very central and providing a very central digital platform and innovation for all the funders and content providers and users, etc., and can solve a lot of our problems, particularly if we want knowledge in a commons, which is, you know, easily accessible and distributed across the world in a very fair way, and so on. So it really is a big part of the solution, and could be a vital element to achieve the SDGs actually, and in the whole TFM sort of agenda, or what's called technology facilitation mechanism, which is to transfer knowledge across countries. I think it could be really quite central. So hopefully you'll join us if you're interested in working with us. We'll set up this kind of network to do, you know, specifically around education and the SDGs. It's my interest, but obviously there's data, there's research, there's lots of other digital material, but I am very interested in the educational resources. Okay, so thanks very much for everyone joining, and we'll see you again. And I know there's an opening talks for the STI forum. People are going to move to them through their Whova, etc. But I'll talk to you all again, and thanks for everyone for joining.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Stephen, Radhika. Yeah.
To see you again sometime. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanos.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.